a little bit of a case study for something where we saw something different while we were doing the testing. We're actually able to perform some type of investigation to help determine where elemental impurities may have been coming from. So just some things that our testing was able to help see that wouldn't have been seen otherwise. So it's a little outside of the regulations, but it was useful to our clients that we did it for. So first off, why it's important to monitor elemental impurities. So obviously, some elements, or a lot of these heavy metals aren't helpful to the human body. They can actually do quite a bit of damage. A couple obvious ones are like mercury and arsenic. I don't think you could find very many people that wouldn't be aware that they don't want to have mercury or arsenic in their medicine going into their body. But then there are quite a few other elemental impurities that can cause damage, or also just build up in the body. There are quite a few diseases or, that people believe could be due to buildup of heavy metals in the body over long periods of time. So that's kind of one of the reasons why this has become important. And then obviously for the drug product itself, control of the elemental impurities is important because the heavy metals can have impact on the active itself. They can cause degradation. They can allow for alternative routes of degradation. So it's a stability and degradation concern for the active, as well as a kind of keeping them out of the human body. So where the elemental impurities can come from. So the making of a drug product obviously involves raw materials. So those raw materials can come from nature. They can be mined out of the earth. So all of those raw materials obviously have the possibility of having elemental impurities in them. But also even synthetic raw materials, excipients, and the API, those are the only components really of the process that become part of the drug product. The capsules, all of that is part of the drug product. So any elemental impurities present in those raw materials will inherently be present in the drug product. So it's important to monitor or to, raw materials are a major source of elemental impurities. Also catalysts. So catalysts in the synthesis. So typically some of the APIs have palladium or nickel or various other metal catalysts that need to be, monitored. If they're used to synthesize the API, you need to make sure that they are out of the API as they're going into the drug product. Otherwise, again, they will be present in the drug product because they're in the API. And then lastly, there are possibilities for contamination from the manufacturing process and leaching metallic impurities out of whether it's the container closure system itself or even out of the equipment in the manufacturing process. So the reason for the change in the regulations, from an analytical perspective, the techniques were kind of outdated. They were wet chemistry techniques. There were some specificity and accuracy issues and sensitivity for all elements. So it didn't obviously look at as many elements and definitely not in as specific a nature as what the change is. And then lastly, and most importantly, is previously the testing was done on the raw materials, the inlet materials, not on the final product. So those last two sources of elemental contamination that we discussed, the manufacturing of the drug product and the container closure itself, were not included as part of the elemental impurities assessment since you were monitoring the raw materials for heavy metals. The new guidelines have been kind of pending for quite some time. It's been about 5 years since I believe we kind of got wind that the elemental impurities regulation was coming out, and I believe it had a few setbacks where it could have been in effect as early as 2015, but they are now officially in place. The FDA has a draft guideline out. The USP has published 232 and 233 as of January 2018, and it also removed 231 for heavy metals, along with removing heavy metals so it removes heavy metals as a test. So it's been removed from, all monographs. I believe the only elemental testing that's been left in there apart from the 232 is if there is specific heavy metals or elemental impurities that are being watched by a different method or by the heavy metals method. Some of those have been left, but for the most part, the heavy metals test has been completely removed. And then in December of 2017, the EP also aligned with the ICH. So USP, EP, and ICH are all aligned on the elemental impurities regulation. So the new guidelines, kind of who they apply to. So the ICH guidelines in 232, 233 applies to drug products for human use. So that's the I guess all of the information in there is intended to be specifically for human use drug products. It does not apply to the drug substance or excipient. Kind of as I said, the testing used to be performed on the drug substance and the excipients, but it has been moved to the drug product. So while the testing isn't required for release of drug substances or excipients per the compendia anymore, the data for the elemental impurities present in those materials is still critical for the drug product manufacturers in the filing company. Dietary supplements are not included. There's actually a different USP chapter, 2232, that covers elemental impurities for that. So it has I think a modified list of elements and limits, but that's not being controlled by 232. These also do not apply to the veterinary products, but kind of with an asterisk there. We have seen recently that the veterinary agencies are requiring elemental analysis, though it's not aligned with the ICH requirements. So, depending on if you are a, veterinarian company that is filing, you want to, reach out or look at the agency specifically that you are filing with to see if there's any information on how elemental impurities should be addressed. We've seen some cases where I believe that it's even a little bit more stringent than the USP, but we've also seen it where it's a little bit, more loose, where if you'd followed the kind of human use regulations, you would have been compliant with that veterinary body. And then, so I guess this is kind of, the USP and EP have removed the elemental impurities testing. I just spoke about that. And then one of the other big changes with the regulation is the technique. We've moved from the wet chemistry to analytical instruments. ICP-MS, ICP-OES are the two instruments that the regulations state that should be used. If you were to use something like an AA or something like that, you would have to validate it within the requirements of the ICP-MS or OES, but the ICP-MS and ICP-OES are the instruments that should be used for this analysis. And the limits, again, have been moved to the drug product from the raw material, and that's to make sure that all of the elemental impurities in the drug product are taken into account when evaluating for elemental impurities. So the elements and limits that need to be monitored. So the elements are split up into 3 different classes of elements, and this is based on the toxicity and the likelihood of occurring. The elements that need to be monitored for each drug product is dependent on the route of administration. So some of the toxicities for elements are obviously different, whether it's inhaled or injected or, I guess, swallowed. So those would all be different. You would have different uptake of those elements. So some of the limits change for those, as well as how toxic they are by that route. So, and then also the maximum daily dose is used to calculate the limit. So the limits for in the ICH and the USP are all based on permissible daily exposure, and that is a micrograms per day of the elemental impurity. So you have to determine the grams per day of drug product that are going to the maximum daily dose that will be going into human patients to calculate how many ppm per your material you can have of the elements. And then the elements themselves, the class 1 is required for all drug products, but then the class 2A, so there's 7 required elements for oral, and then as you add parenteral and inhalation, there are some more elements that get added that are required. For the other elements, there are 24. You can see there's a table. We don't have it in this presentation, but in ICH and the USP and the EP, they all have the same table of all 24 elements. There are also tables that clearly say yes or no, whether it has to be considered based on your route of administration. And then any of the 24 elements, if they are intentionally added in the process, have to also be monitored. So there are 2 strategies with being compliant. The recommended approach is risk assessment. This is a risk-based approach to demonstrate control of the elemental impurities. Control of the elemental impurities is by demonstrating that you're below the control threshold, the control limit, which is 30% of the PDE. And then you also have to demonstrate that it's with variability as well. So the regulatory requirement for variability stated in the USP ICH is 3 batches of the drug product, 3 lots. So if all 3 lots are below the control threshold, then it would be considered under control and that you had assessed enough variability to make that determination. So in addition to that data, you would also want to have data from the on the API and the excipients themselves. So whether it's from testing or from the vendors of those materials. And then you can also use scientific knowledge and literature in that filing. So with this approach, you would have a filing report where you would summarize kind of all of the possible sources of contamination, what the risks are, and then you would include any data or information you would have to state why the risk was, negligible, or if you had a major risk or something like that, you would be able to speak to it in that report, which you would file with your ANDA or NDA. And then the other option is testing of the drug product at release. So we've obviously seen this for many other tests, but you would have to have a fully validated method for the elements that you need to analyze. And then whenever you would manufacture a batch of the material, you would test it and release it for all of those elements at the time. So it would be on every C of A, the testing, so you wouldn't have a risk assessment filing report as much as you would have, on your C of A, and a method that would say, this is how we're going to control the elemental impurities. So the two different options, the risk assessment obviously requires that you be under control. So option 2 is, in some cases, what's necessary to do if you have an elemental impurity that appears to be, it's below the limit, but it's above the control limit. You would, you move to a validated method in testing at time of manufacturing. So for filing, early phase work, so IND filing, it's not required to have elemental impurities assessed. We'll talk a little bit about some of our offerings, and maybe in those early stages, it may be useful to get a feel for how many elemental impurities may be present, but you don't need to have validated methods or anything at that point. When you reach your NDA, AND file, it is required that you be compliant with this elemental impurities regulation. You need to have either your filing report, your risk assessment completed, or your plan to test and how you will maintain control whenever manufacturing. And then for current commercial products, so as of 2018, this has become effective. But if you are a current commercial product, it's required that you be compliant with the elemental impurities regulation, and that can be done by adding the report to your yearly update. So getting into some of Alcami's offerings, so I kind of just mentioned the kind of early phase work. So we do have some semi-quantitative and fully quantitative screening methods, and these are methods where they don't have any validation performed. There's no check for specificity, accuracy, or precision or anything like that, but they are relatively accurate for most elements and can quickly look for up to 55 elements for the semi-quantitative screening. It actually uses an algorithm to determine how much there is. We have actually had a case where we compared that to a validated method and obtained similar results. So it's a pretty accurate method, but it doesn't have any validation studies to go along with it. So it would not be suitable to be included in the filing report or in the, or as part of a method, but it is useful to kind of get a look at, if you want to look at a drug substance or a excipient, or look at multiple excipients from multiple of the same excipient from different vendors to see if there's any concern with elements or something like that. You could kind of do a cost-effective screening. And that's the same for the fully quantitative screening. The only difference with the fully quantitative is that we have elemental standards for each element that we would be testing. The next offering we have, which is the one that we are doing most frequently now, it's our most cost-effective and efficient way to support the risk assessment filing. We call it our risk assessment testing. And what this is, it's a kind of one-time analysis that is performed on 3 lots of any material, the drug product, the drug substance, or any list of the excipients, where we demonstrate specificity, linearity, accuracy, sensitivity, and precision of the method in the sample matrix at the time of testing. We optimize the method and make sure that all of these validation studies are working. And if they do meet all the validation requirements, then we can, the results can be reported as, validated results that have had all of these studies demonstrated for the method. I guess kind of where it's more efficient is we don't generate a test procedure for it. The plan is that you'll generate the results, use them in the filing, and then not really have to go back to the method ever in the future. So it's it's a very quick way to do that assessment. Couple deliverables from this, obviously with the testing, if you're samples are out of control, then you may need to move on to some type of validation study. We do provide, with this, you get a report that has all of the validation studies, their acceptance criteria, their results, the sample results for the multiple lots tested, obviously recommending 3, but we've done as many as 10 lots of different raw materials. And then a method summary. So those are important for the filing to be able to say that you have a copy of the method, you could repeat it if needed, and you have all of the validation study results along with the results that you've included in the filing. And then, like I said, if for some reason this found any of the elements to be out of control, the method would be already have been developed, so you can move straight into a validation protocol if you had an element or multiple elements that needed to be under control, under additional control, which would be testing at time of manufacturing at release. One of our other options is method development. So we do perform method developments, and usually we're doing these when there's custom elements or special quantitation limits that are required. So again, it's the same studies as before, but we develop the method so that it will be validatable. And then the kind of deliverable for that is a validation protocol, the proposed test procedure, and we can provide development reports if needed. And then I just spoke about the validation protocol. So we will, after we develop a method or do the risk assessment and determine that a validation is needed, we do full ICH validations. So we would do the studies here: specificity, linearity, accuracy, intermediate precision, method repeatability, solution stability, LOQ, all of those studies in order to have a fully validated method that is suitable for release testing on a commercial product. And then that would come with a validated report or validation report and a validated test procedure. And then one of our last offerings is not really a testing option, but is actually the risk assessment regulatory report. I've been referring to this as kind of the filing report. It's the risk assessment report that you would send in with your filing to say, these are, we've assessed the 5 main sources of elemental impurity contamination. That's the drug substance, the excipients, the water, the manufacturing process, and the container closure. You would provide data for the drug product, substance, excipients, and if E&L studies are applicable, if they're needed, which are required for non-solid dosage forms. So if it's a non-solid dosage form, you would have to have E&L studies performed, and that data would be included in that report. It would go through process and utilities, and then kind of have a conclusion at the end, kind of stating that the drug product is under control for all of the reasons above, and that no additional elemental impurities analysis needs to be done, obviously, beyond the kind of life cycle management. If there's any changes in the process or changes in the manufacturing line or vendors, then that would have to be reevaluated as part of that. This is just kind of a general or a quick look at some of our kind of lead times on this. So we are offering, rush timelines on some of this. So as far as how quick things can be done, the R&D screenings can be done as quick as a week, even faster in special circumstances. The risk assessment testing, really from the time that we get all of the material and alignment with, the sponsor on what the elements we're going to be testing and their limits, then it's, in less than 2 weeks, there can be a report for that. Same with the development. It can be done in 2 weeks, and then the filing report takes another week. And then if it moves into validation, that's where the timeline may stretch out a little bit more, because that would have to be done after the risk assessment or the method development. But we can deliver a risk assessment in a very short amount of time, in as little as 2 weeks. And then routine testing would be something done if needed, if we need to perform the routine testing, since with the validated method, that could be done, again, in that 1 to 2 week time frame as well. Just some of the information that's needed to start this kind of work immediately. So I mentioned these earlier. So for determining the limits and elements, the route of administration is important. Any catalyst, intentionally added elements, these 2 things are to help determine what elements are going to be selected. The maximum daily dose will help us select the limits. And then the materials, need to be made available for testing. So 3 lots is what we, recommend. That's what the USP ICH says is acceptable for showing variability across the process of that material. And then, so that's all we would need to be able to get started on analysis for the elemental impurities regulation. So this is just kind of a quick flow chart. So we've had a few, we'll go through some of the case studies, but we've had a few of these products where we've done things like we'll start with R&D screening, and based on the R&D screening, it can be determined if we want to move to risk assessment testing or method development. If the R&D screening shows, hey, there's no elemental impurities present here, then it's a good candidate to move into risk assessment testing, which may very quickly turn into the filing report, and that could all be done in as little as a 4-week time frame. Or it may indicate that, a method's going to need to be developed and then validated because there is an element that, that's present that's not going to be under control. And then you could, kind of bypass either the risk assessment or even the development. You could do the risk assessment and then validate for whichever element need to be done. And then obviously release testing can be performed, but just a kind of flow of how that can go. And we have also seen where, we would just do, any of these at various stages where we could do an R&D screening early in the process, maybe while selecting and getting set up for later phase activities, but just to make sure you wouldn't have any issues when you get to that point. You wouldn't necessarily have to do it all in a very short amount of time. All right, so then kind of moving into what, I guess I had pitched as the culmination of this, and the real, meat for this webinar is the successful filings that we've seen and kind of what approaches we've had people follow. So we have supported many clients so far through the filing, and we've now kind of been doing it for long enough that we're starting to see if they're, if we're getting approvals are coming through or if we're getting comments from the agencies. So, in one case, maybe our earliest case, we have partnered with a sponsor that went through the validated method for the drug product and testing to be performed at the release. This was actually a couple of years ago, but that for that product, we had validated methods for the drug product, and then it was put on the specification and then just tested at release. It's still being tested at release, but that one was approved without any comments related to elemental impurities. So obviously a validated method is an acceptable way to go about doing this. For the risk assessment, so we've done a few different approaches to this, or variations of kind of the same approach. In the first case we've had where the drug substance, excipients, and the drug product are all tested with that risk assessment testing I mentioned, which is a kind of at time of use validation to demonstrate the validity of the method, generate the results, provide the report, and then never do the testing again. And then we did provide the filing report for that. And we've had where no regulatory comments were received, either the product has been approved or that the comments are being addressed, but that none of them are related to elemental impurities. For the second case, we've had where the drug product and the major excipient had the method validated and testing was performed on multiple lots. Between 3 and 6 lots of the drug product and excipient were tested. And then that data was provided in the risk assessment filing report, along with vendor data for all of the other excipients in the drug substance. And that one was approved by the agencies without any comments regarding elemental impurities. And then kind of the third case is we've had where just the drug product risk assessment testing was performed. We did that on multiple lots. And then provided vendor data for the drug substance and the high-risk excipients. And in that case also, I guess I didn't have the summary for that. In that case also, it was approved without any regulatory comments. So I guess all of this is just to show that the risk assessment testing that we're doing, which is that kind of efficient, very short time frame testing with the kind of validation at time of testing and the report from that and the filing report generated from all that, it has been it's been successful so far with the regulatory bodies. We haven't had any concerns over that approach, and we've now done the testing for I think quite a few hundred drug products, and we've now been doing it long enough that we've seen the agencies start approving drug products that went through that approach. We have had a couple where the strategies were a little bit different. This is just kind of one example of that, where our client decided that we were going to take a different approach. We're also going to do the risk assessment approach, but we were going to I guess take a slightly more risky approach than the one that the one that we have recommended. But so they were going to take vendor data from the drug substance and then write the filing report based on that. And there was justification for that. It wasn't, I guess I wouldn't say it was wrong. It was a little bit more risky, but it was in a sense that, it was a simple formulation and that the drug substance was the primary component. So using the drug substance to say that it was under control, it was scientifically, kind of rational, but we did get agency comments on that we've seen that essentially require additional justification. It was about a specific step of the drug product manufacturing. Where was the evidence that it didn't provide elemental impurities into the drug product? And obviously, we didn't have testing on the drug product, so there was no way to demonstrate that from that standpoint. So without that data, the only real answer to this is to generate the data on the drug product or justify that you wouldn't get elemental impurities from that step. That's why it's critical to test the drug product for the elemental impurities. If you were going to test nothing but the drug product, that would be the most critical one to test to show that the elemental impurities for the entire process, including manufacturing, would be part of that assessment. Then one of the most common agency comments that we've seen, so this isn't something that has required additional testing. We've seen it for quite a few of the filings we've had. It's just really just kind of a nice to know to provide you guys that the FDA is asking that there be something on the C of A for the registration batches to say that the elemental impurities are under control, even though it's, being filed with a filing report that talks about this, being under control. It actually needs to be handled in a similar manner to the residual solvents. So here at Alcami, we have residual solvent statements that are provided on the specification. Because it's on the specification, we actually translates directly onto the C of A, where you have the justification for why you wouldn't be testing residual solvents. And what we found is that should also be done for elemental impurities. Just having the report isn't sufficient on if you've done the risk assessment filing approach, then you would have also an elemental impurity statement that you would want included on the C of A for all manufactured batches. That really is just a reference to say the elemental impurities have been assessed, through risk assessment, and that, the testing wasn't performed, but it would just be a reference provided on the C of A. So we have seen that. And the request is usually for a revised C of A, or at least a kind of templated C of A that will show that for all future batches, this statement would be on there. So for anybody getting ready to file or hasn't filed yet, just, if you're in a spot where you can kind of make that change to make sure you have that statement on your C of A's, then you won't have to, worry about answering that response or responding to that comment. And then, so kind of that last thing, it's a little bit, the last thing I'd mentioned on the overview, it's a little bit different than the previous ones, where it's not, specifically to responses from the agencies, but more about a couple of cases where the testing that we've done at Alcami has helped determine where the elemental impurities in a drug product or a drug substance were out of control. So for one of our clients, we had testing on multiple lots, and we found chromium to be out of control, actually above the limit for one of the 3 lots. We confirmed this with an investigation. This was actually one of the methods. This was our chance where we actually compared our risk assessment method to our R&D screening and found them to, even though having different preparations, provided very similar results. It was kind of a best option we had to have another method confirm the results of the original test. And actually was found that this went back to a new mix tank in the drug product manufacturing process. There was something that needed to be, it was the first batch made on it, and the chromium was out of control, and it was for that reason. So able to identify that, and able to not have to say that there was something wrong where the drug products were over the limit or it was out of control. You could do additional testing on other batches to show that was the case, and proceed with more of a risk assessment type approach. In the second case, it was for a drug substance where we actually found lead to be over the limit for one of the lots of drug substance and over the threshold for the others. And with the testing, we did quite a few lots, and then we were able to, with the help of the client, look at the kind of trend in the data and the manufacturing order and find that the iron was, or the lead was clearly coming from or coming from the vendor, that it was coming from the vendor, and that it appeared that it was kind of decreasing over time. So it was just another option where the testing of multiple lots was able to kind of help determine where the elemental impurities concern was coming from, and it kind of allows it to be addressed without it being something that, you know, requires a validated method or something else, you know, in the future. And then just kind of how to avoid this type of event. So I guess the one thing you don't want is with either of these cases, you don't want it to be that you had, you know, you're about to file, you need to do this testing right now, and you haven't looked at the elemental impurities at all. So if you have something like this happen, you would then, you know, kind of have to you'd have to resolve it, and it would possibly delay your filing. So the best way to avoid it is to test early, you know, as soon as maybe registration lots are available. Go ahead and get the ICP-MS elemental impurities assessment done. Then the other option, which I've mentioned already, is to possibly screen, using the screening methods, you know, look for elemental impurities earlier in the process, maybe while selecting vendors for excipients or raw materials. Kind of look out for the potential elements using those kind of cheaper methods that can be run quickly, just to make sure that you won't have a problem towards the end. And then once ready, you can quickly move through the risk assessment testing to write the filing report. Because in most circumstances, I would say in probably greater than 99% of materials we've tested, we have not found any of these elemental impurities to be out of control. It is required to look for them, but for the most part, drug products, the raw materials are under control. And in a lot of the cases, the vendors are providing very good elemental impurity assessments that can be included in the filing. So it's not that testing needs to be done, but it's definitely worth reaching out to them to get that information, because we've seen some where they follow a very similar approach to what we've, you know, said here, as far as testing, how many lots they're testing, and then what limits and things like that, so that they can just be very quickly plugged into your filing report without you ever having to generate any more data. I guess with that, are there any questions on elemental impurities or any of the stuff presented here?
Thanks, Chris. And like you just mentioned, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the questions tab on the side. And as Chris mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have joining us Julia Sproul, who is a senior scientist here at Alcami, to help with the question and answer section here. So if you have any, please feel free to type them into the question bar and we will address those. How do you address alternate routes of administration?
Yes, so I mentioned the, I guess, oral, parenteral, and inhalation routes, which are specifically spelled out in the regulations, but there are additional routes of administration. Obviously, there's kind of, I guess, you know, dermal applications where you would, you know, there's suppositories, there's a few different routes of administrations, but there's actually, those all have different exposure factors, and the exposure factors are kind of linked up to those three that I mentioned. So the, for kind of skin applied drug products, those would have the same exposure factor as an oral drug product, and the same with like a suppository. It's the same exposure factor as an oral product, so you can use the same elements and same limits, but it's based on the exposure factor, which can be found for all routes of administration.
Okay. How does this change in regulation impact control of the drug substance? Is it still appropriate to test against the guidance in USP 232 and 233?
So for the drug substance, it's not required to test against the 232, 233, but it is still it's still important to ensure that, if you are a drug substance provider, that the elemental impurities are under control, because it would be something that could cause an issue in anything using that as the active of the drug product. So it doesn't need to be a release test. Like I said, most of the vendors that we work with, they have performed this where they run a lot of them do 3 batches a year using a validated method, and just that allows them to provide a report to anybody that would use it to say that yes, the elemental impurities are under control for this. Because if it's a compendial method or it's a compendial material with a monograph, there is no longer a heavy metals test on there, so it's not required to monitor for it. But if it's expected that it may be used as an API for human use, it would be beneficial still to use 232 or 233, and the limits can be applied to it. And there's also a option 1, which assumes a maximum daily dose of 10 grams, which is quite high depending on what the route may be, but that can be used as a way of setting the limit in order to kind of make sure you're looking in a range that would be applicable for most people that may use it.
What is the estimated timeline for completing a development and validation for an inhalation dosage form?
So from the receipt of the material, we can go pretty quickly on this. The developments we can perform in as little as 2 weeks. Protocol generation takes a few days, but obviously after the approval of the protocol, we're looking at a 2 to 4 week completion of that. So shortest time, I would say, was probably 4 weeks from the start material received and start of work to the end of the validation report. But kind of standard turnaround times would be more on the kind of 6 to 9 week time frame if it wasn't needed to be expedited.
Do you need a specification set during the preliminary stages of testing for ICP?
So the specifications are based on the guidelines. So there's no, in the guidelines themselves, they don't state that there's any need to lower the limits below less than what they are based on the results. So the specification limits should be set based on what the anticipated maximum daily dose is. So, if it's for validating a method, then obviously you will have specification limits as part of your specification for the testing that would be performed on the registration batch and commercial batches. But as far as doing if you're going to be doing the risk assessment approach, then you wouldn't have the limits would not be included in your specification, but you would include, the limits you assessed against in part of your filing report to show that you were lower than those limits, but use the guideline for the specification limits.
Do you recommend a quantitative test or a limit test?
We recommend a quantitative test. So I know USP 233 mentions the limit test. That actually is a limit test where you run at 50%. 50% of the limit. I guess the one concern with the, validating that approach is if the limit test is at 50% of the limit, the control threshold is actually at 30% of the limit for each element. So even if you demonstrated using that method that you were less than the limit, you wouldn't be able to take that data and say that you were under control. So we recommend a quantitative test that goes below that 30% threshold, because if that method, works and has to be validated, it can be. But if something is accurate and it's precise and all the validation studies meet, but it's over the control threshold, then you would still, you could then validate it. But at least gives you the opportunity to see that, no, they're all below 25% or whatever the LOQ. We typically use 25% as the LOQ to make sure that we're well below that 30% threshold. But that's why we recommend quantitative, to avoid being in a spot where you're passing the limit, but you can't state whether or not you're under control.
Where do you find these exposure factors?
I know it's available obviously it's available on the internet. It's in one of the guidelines. I guess we can provide that after this. We can provide the exposure factors as a table that has all of them in it. I'd have to locate it real quick and we can send it out.
If during component assessment we find that all elemental impurities are below 30% PDE, is it necessary to implement drug product release testing?
We recommend it. I think the additive approach is typically taken, I guess it's similar to the residual solvent approach, where if you're less than 30% for all of the inlet materials, then technically you should be less than 30% for the drug product. But I guess where this is different than residual solvents is that while going through the manufacturing process, it's actually possible to pick up elemental impurities. In kind of those two later cases I showed, we've actually seen where the manufacturing process itself is responsible for the elements being out of control. So in all of the successful filings we've seen without any type of comment or anything to address, it's, the drug product has been assessed to ensure that the entire process provides, you with a drug product that's under control.
How do you decide how to modify the specification from heavy metals to ICP?
So the modification, I believe, so the ICP limits are much different. It includes a lot more elements. I believe the heavy metals is not more than 20 ppm, but it's actually based on a different list of elements. I believe it includes the class 1 elements, your arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and lead. So those ones may be included, and those ones have very low PDEs, but some of the other elements like nickel and chromium and a few other ones are already well above that 20 ppm limit is where they're set in the USP 232 has the table. So I would, you won't convert the heavy metals limit over, you will actually just switch to the limits for the elemental impurities that need to be monitored.
Would you recommend monitoring for elemental impurities in your raw materials and excipients?
Yes, I would, but I wouldn't recommend doing it on all lots or doing it all of the time. Like I said, what we've seen, it seems to be, most useful is if there's like a validated method and three batches tested, and then it seems like a lot of times that's kind of a yearly occurrence that multiple lots are tested every year, or even if you kind of go into even like a skip lot approach where you could say that, yeah, we've been manufacturing this for 5 years and we validated a method 5 years ago and validated it into testing, but we've been, periodically checking to make sure that it, the material remains under control. That would be the recommended approach that I would take.
Any preference for ICP-MS versus ICP-OES?
I guess from a functionality standpoint and, and how applicable it is, no. They're both equivalent and they're both capable of hitting these limits. The only difference with the ICP-MS, it has a wider dynamic range. It can be a little bit more sensitive. So for only in, rare cases or where daily doses reach, 500 grams or even, higher than that, do you need the sensitivity to be able to see a lot lower? And then also for inhalations, those have much lower limits as well. But for most cases, definitely most oral, parenteral products, they're both, both can be used, but, the ICP-MS may be needed if the limits or the QL that's required is very low.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Is there any consideration given for duration of administration with regards to the PDEs? For organic bleachables, the limit is typically 1.5 micrograms per day over a 70-year lifetime, so one can tolerate higher amounts for shorter periods. When looking at elemental PDEs, can we make adjustments based on the short-term duration versus a long-term duration? For example, class 1 elements are of much greater concern if they are absorbed daily over time as opposed to a single exposure.
So it's mentioned in the new regulation. It doesn't specifically say that you can recalculate the limit. It doesn't allow for the limit to be adjusted, but it does mention that for things like to get special considerations, if it's a very short-term exposure, you could justify having things over the control limit or over the limit itself. But that would have to be done, specifically, I guess, with your filing with the agency to provide that justification. But also, yeah. So I forgot what I was about to say, but if it comes back to me, I'll bring it up.
Are there any special considerations regarding PDE for pediatric products? Yes, elemental impurities PDE for pediatric products.
I believe they have the same limits. There hasn't been a different limit applied for them. And I remember what I was going to say with the last one. It's actually so for not even just for short-term exposure, but if it is like for kind of like a life-altering medication, or for kind of something that doesn't, if you're treating something that doesn't have any type of treatment, that's another chance where you can have special consideration for the elemental impurities present. Like, obviously, the elements may be bad over 70 years, but if you don't have this, you won't have 70 years to take it. And there's, obviously special, similar with, short-term exposure would have to be handled kind of for that specific product.
Great. Any further questions? All right, well, thank you all very much for your great questions. And for further information on the presentation or on Alcami, you can send an email to our presenter, Chris Williams. You can see his email address up on the screen. Or if you would like further information about the Division of Pharmacy Professional Development at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the website is also on your screen as well. And you can find the social networks for both of our organizations on the screen. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, it has been recorded, and you will receive a follow-up in the next few days to a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides. So with that, we thank you all very much for joining us today and hope you have a great rest of your day.